Hello, Pilgrim friends and family. Welcome to Summer Reading with Mrs. Conniff. Today is June the 19th. It's a special day in history known as Juneteenth. So I'm going to read a book about a little girl who marched in her time period to celebrate and honour this holiday. I looked up a few snippets of information about Juneteenth so I could share those with you. And I went to the website called www.juneteenth.com to make sure I was getting the information right. Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. It was on June 19, 1865, that Union soldiers, led by Major General Gordon Granger, arrived in Galveston, Texas, to announce that slaves were now free, a full 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln. And I hadn't have time to read very much else, but there was a lot of information about the theories of why it took so long. So I would encourage you to go and look up some more information about Juneteenth on that website. Okay, so I'm going to read The Youngest Marcher today. The Youngest Marcher, the true story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, a young civil rights activist, written by Cynthia Levinson and illustrated by Vanessa Brantley Newton, published by Athenaeum Books for Young Readers in 2017. I'll read the author's note at the end if you want to stay tuned for that, as well as I will read about the author and the illustrator. Here's our title page. Here's our title page. The Youngest Marcher. Whenever Mike flew into town, Audrey and her mama cooked barbecued ribs, stewed greens, sweet potato souffle, and Audrey's favorite, hot rolls baptized in butter. Other folks knew Mike as Martin or Dr. King. The Hendrickses used his nickname. They did the same with other ministers too, like Fred Shuttlesworth and Jim Bevel. After Mike blessed the feast, Mama expected Audrey to keep still during supper. But when grown-ups talked about wiping out the segregation laws that kept black and white people apart in Birmingham, she just had to speak up. Audrey intended to go places and do things like anybody else. I want to eat my ice cream inside Newberry's. I want to sit downstairs at the Alabama. I don't want hand-me-down school books. But stalls at the counter, plush movie theatre seats, books so fresh they'd crackle when you open them. Those were for white children. Hush, hissed Mama. 9-year-old children should not speak in front of company, especially ministers like Mike, Fred, and Jim, who are bringing dreams of justice. Audrey knew all about segregation. She knew to pay the driver at the front of the bus, then step off and walk around to the back door, drink from the fountain with the dirty bowl and warm water, use the freight elevator at department stores downtown. Front row seats, cool water, elevators with white-gloved operators. Laws said those were for white kids. Every Monday night, Audrey and her mama and daddy and her aunts, uncles and cousins joined neighbours and friends at Fred's church for worship, fellowship and testimony. She sang and swayed along with the movement choir, her voice spirited and spiritual. Black and white together, we shall overcome. For once, she didn't have to keep still. Then came testimonies. White store owners won't hire me. Ku Kluxers chased me. Policemen called me names. The hateful stories made Audrey squirm. She tried to tell her mama, "That's not right." Shh. How could Mama expect her to hush? She had to make things right. But what could she do? When Mike visited Fred's church, thousands of people crowded around her to hear him preach. In a voice as taut as steel cables, as smooth as glass, he intoned, "Segregation is morally wrong and sinful." "That's true." Fired up, Audrey sat taller. "An unjust law is no law at all," he proclaimed. Audrey had listened to Mike explain his plan at her supper table and knew what he meant. If a law is unjust, disobey it. Sit down inside Newberry's, picket those white stores, march to protest those unfair laws. Why, even marching was against the law. Then get arrested. "Fill the jails," Mike exclaimed. "Fill Birmingham's jails so full that policemen can't squeeze in one more person. Pack cells so tight that police will have to quit arresting people for demanding their rights." Audrey just knew Mike's plan would work. She twisted in her pew to see which grown-ups would walk down the aisle, volunteer for jail. But they mostly stayed put, eyes staring at their feet, hands on their knees, feet, hands, and knees didn't move. "Fill the jails," Mike pleaded, meeting after meeting. But heads shook. All around her, Audrey heard, "No, best not break those segregation laws. Boss man will fire me. Landlord will evict me. Policemen will beat me." If nobody protested, Mike's plan would fail. Police could keep arresting anyone any time, for anything, forever. Audrey would never be able to go places and do things like everybody else. One night, Jim announced a new idea. "If grown-ups won't do it, fill the jails with children." Audrey leaped to her feet. "I want to go to jail," she declared. Mama looked deep and saw that Audrey's eyes begged. "Please." "Okay," Mama said. Audrey strutted down that aisle. She was going to ale. Two mornings later, she put on a fresh-dressed pinafore and shiny Mary Janes with turned-down socks. Protesters got to look nice. In the meantime, her daddy bought her a game to help her pass the time in jail. Her mama and daddy took her by Center Street Elementary to tell her teacher she'd be absent, maybe for a whole week. Miss Wills wrapped her arms around her. Audrey knew she was proud of her. She said goodbye to her grandparents. "You'll be fine," her grandmother said. She knew Audrey would be brave. So did Audrey. Then her mama and daddy drove her to 16th Street Baptist Church, where the children were gathering. Even before she reached the door, Audrey heard loud voices chanting freedom songs. Inside, hundreds of big kids called out to friends and crowded around signs for their high schools. Parker, Carver. Her head swiveled. Where was the sign for Center Street Elementary? She was the only protester from her school, the youngest child in the whole church, and she knew no one. Audrey huddled by her parents in the basement. But when Jim lined her up with the others, 2 by 2, and the doors swung open, Audrey straightened up. She was going to break a law and go to jail to help make things right. Clutching a protest sign in one hand and her game in the other, Audrey marched out the door. She stomped and sang, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round." You can read some of the signs. Can a man love God and hate his brother? Segregation is sin, justice for all. Half a block from the church, a white policeman stopped Audrey. He pointed toward a police van. "Sentence, 1 week in juvenile jail." A matron locked Audrey into a day room with 24 other girls, all older, all bigger, all strangers, Audrey sat down alone and slipped the cover off her game. "I told you to sit down," the matron yelled. Audrey jumped. She didn't remember standing up. The matron dragged her to a dark, empty room. "When I tell you something, you do it," she commanded, "or I'll leave you here." Can you imagine how scary that must have been? Remember, she was in elementary school. Trembling, Audrey quietly followed the matron back to the day room, put away her game, lay down her head and cried. Jail was harder than she'd thought, and she wasn't fine after all. By evening, Audrey was hungry and tired. For dinner, soupy, oily, tasteless grits. At night, a bare mattress with one thin sheet for a cover. Audrey and her cellmates were let outdoors into an empty concrete pen surrounded by high prison walls. The older girls talked together. Audrey wondered what her classmates were doing. Miss Wills would be keeping them busy. On another day, Audrey was sent to a huge room and told to sit in a chair that was so high her feet dangled above the floor. 4 white men glared at her. She'd never talked to a white man before. "Are you against America?" one demanded to know. "No, sir," she answered politely. "What do you talk about at those meetings?" another asked. "Our freedom." "Why did you march?" "To go places and do things like anybody else." What was wrong with that? Every mealtime, Audrey stared at greasy grits. She could barely spoon them into her mouth, let alone swallow them every night. The cot's wire springs jabbed. Every morning she had nothing to do but sit alone with her game. In the afternoons, though, more kids crowded into the day room. Some days, many of them arrived sopping wet. A girl explained that firemen aimed powerful hoses at the children. Surging water spun them off their feet and down the street. They got up and kept marching anyway, until they too were sent to jail. By Audrey's 5th day in detention, the police couldn't squeeze in one more person. "We filled up all the rooms! We filled up all the rooms!" Audrey practically jumped up and down. She was so proud. "We filled up all the rooms!" Watching television in the day room, she saw black people stroll straight into stores and restaurants like they belonged there. No one else could be sent to jail. Everything had changed. After 7 days, Audrey went home. Her mama and daddy wrapped their arms tight around her, washed the jail off her, and for dinner, hot rolls, baptized in butter. Two months later, the city of Birmingham wiped segregation laws clean off the books. Audrey licked her spoon clean at Newberry's counter, like everybody else. Black and white together, like we belong. So 1865 was the date that Juneteenth happened, and here we are in 2020. Still people are marching for equality, and this took place in 1963, which is, 50-something years ago, more than 50 years ago, and it's asking for the same things that people are asking for today. So I'm going to read the author's note, and here's what I love about, I always tell my students, don't I, Pilgrim students, that if you're reading a non-fiction book, you have not finished reading the book if you have not read the author's note, especially if it is about something historical and involving a real person, because sometimes they add facts and sometimes they explain things that they weren't able to include. And usually I'm really happy when I find a photograph of the person that the book is about. And here we have a photograph, there we go, of Audrey Faye Hendricks, young civil rights activist. So let's read what the author says about her. Every day Audrey Faye Hendricks spent in jail, her mother Lola called someone she knew there to make sure her daughter was safe. The day after her release, Audrey returned to Miss Will's class. She didn't tell her classmates about marching or jail, though. It didn't dawn on me that it was a big deal, she said. But it was. Audrey was one of more than 3,000 children who were arrested in Birmingham, Alabama in May 1963. The Children's March, which was planned by Reverend James Bevel, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., affected not only Birmingham, but America. That summer, young people held protests in nearly 200 cities. President John F. Kennedy spoke on television about prejudice and sent a civil rights bill to Congress. On August 28th, about 250,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. to hear Dr. King preach about his dreams of freedom. I had the honor of talking with Audrey in her home where she grew up. She showed me the table at which Dr. King blessed their meals and the upright piano where she practiced singing civil rights songs, including Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round. Audrey told me that she remained an activist afterward. She volunteered to integrate a high school, enrolling as one of its first black students. It took a while for whites and blacks to work together, she said, but it was what we fought for. After graduating from college and working in Dallas, Texas, Audrey returned to Birmingham, where she taught preschool and led Head Start programs. Years later, she earned a graduate degree researching women, like her mother and herself, who were involved in the civil rights movement. Schools around the country invited her to speak about her experience as the youngest known marcher. Nicknamed the Civil Rights Queen, Audrey Faye Hendricks died in 2009. Here's a quote from her at the bottom. What a difference the Children's March has made in this nation. Audrey Faye Hendricks, January 12, 2008. So like in the note here, it says that more than 200 cities had protest marches, and that's what's happening in our country right now because people have had enough and it's time. If you get this book, at the back there is a recipe for hot rolls baptized in butter. It has the directions. Okay, so we're going to read the author and illustrator information at the back of the book. Cynthia Levinson was in high school when Audrey Faye Hendricks marched to jail, and she knows she would not have been as brave as Audrey. But when Cynthia met Audrey 45 years later, she knew she had to write a book about her for young readers. She spent more than 3 years interviewing marchers and researching the events. Her book, We've Got a Job, the 1963 Birmingham Children's March, tells the story for older readers. Cynthia has also written about social justice in Watch Out for Flying Kids, how 2 circuses, 2 countries, and 9 kids confront conflict and build community. She and her husband divide their time between Austin, Texas, and Boston, Massachusetts. A portion of the author's proceeds from sales of this book will be donated to the Jefferson County Head Start program, where Audrey Faye Hendricks worked as an adult. Visit Cynthia at cynthialevinson.com. Vanessa Brantley Newton is a self-taught artist and has attended both Fashion Institute of Technology and School of Visual Arts of New York, where she studied fashion and children's illustration, respectively. Vanessa is the illustrator of many books, including Ruby's New Home, A Team Stays Together, and Justin and the Bully, all by Tony and Lauren Dungy, as well as Presenting Tallulah by Tori Spelling. She hopes that when people look at her work, it will make them feel happy in some way, or even reclaim a bit of their childhood. Visit Vanessa at oolalladesignstudio.blogspot.com. And I know since 2017 she has written quite a few more books or illustrated quite a few more books. So Vanessa Brantley Newton is somebody certainly to look up. Okay, so just wanted to read something that was relevant today, honour of Juneteenth and the people who are marching for better lives for Black people in this country. Thank you. Have a happy summer. Hope you enjoyed the story.